A little while ago, we took a look at the Pandora's Box 4S Plus. This sucker right here. It's a huge arcade stick with an emulation system built inside of it, and we showed it off and mentioned that there were quite a few problems with it. But a bunch of you out there reached out to me to say that you had a better experience with it, and in some cases, a worse experience, which was weird. But you know what? That's to be expected, because no matter where you get these things, they're always going to be a little bit different. But these folks reached out to us on eBay that sent us something new. This is the Pandora's Box 5S. Take a look at it. This system here is going to be the exact same system you get if you choose to get it from the link in the description. Now, we don't make any money from those links on the description or the clicks or anything like that, but why we wanted to make this video was to show that this one product here that's supposed to be better than the previous one is going to be exactly the same if you choose to get it. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Let's find out. This is the Pandora's Box 5S. Look at this thing. It's a giant arcade stick with a whole bunch of games built into it. And it just looks kind of like the original one that we looked at, the Pandora's Box 4S Plus. The only things physically that have changed from the previous one to this model here is that there was buttons on the left that allowed you to turn off the lighting and turned it into a USB secondary controller, and those are gone. You can't turn off the lighting on this thing, it's always going to remain on, and although you did lose that USB switch thing, you can still just plug it up straight to a computer and use this controller as an actual USB controller to play any kind of game you want. Something we mentioned in the previous video looking at the other Pandora's Box arcade stick was that no matter where you get these things, chances are they're going to be manufactured by completely different groups. And I really can't tell you who designed this one, but this was pretty well done. It's a much smaller case, not by a heck of a lot, but just enough to really make it easier to move it around. And the buttons they use and the joysticks, I believe, are higher quality. Now you still get that really nice clicky joystick, but the buttons are also clicky, which just is a lot more better in my opinion. Outside of those things though, the external hardware is virtually identical. The big differences here are in the software, at least that's what we're led to believe. So without further ado, let's take a look at all the games on the Pandora's Box 5S. Just as a recap, the original Pandora's Box system we looked at had 815 games, and there were a number of problems, mostly relating to the fact that you didn't see the intro screens anymore, and in some instances the games just didn't run very well. There were a number of issues all around the machine in the way that it actually played games, and primarily that was my biggest concern with it. Virtually every single game that we played had screen tearing and graphical glitches that were not in the original releases, which just made them really unfun to play. But now? Now, we have 1,299 games built into this machine. That's right, I'm gonna be here for a lot longer playing a lot more games. And I have to replay all the old ones too, just to see if a couple of them got better all of a sudden. So let's buckle up and hope for the best. As soon as you start up this system, you'll notice that it has the exact same layout as the previous one, only the difference here is that all of the games are listed in alphabetical order, something that is a little bit of a welcome change, because this time around it's a lot easier to find the games you're looking for. The first game we tried was Street Fighter 2. Now we did find one version of this game that ran pretty well, although it had a little bit of screen tearing here and there, but there were other versions of this game that we weren't aware of. Now there were the other arcade releases of Street Fighter 2, but we also found this one here, which just didn't work at all. And it took a little bit of hunting to find the right version of Street Fighter 2 that we wanted to play, because unfortunately, even though all of the games here are listed in alphabetical order, all the titles aren't very descriptive, and in some cases, the title wasn't even attached to the right ROM. There are just so many versions of Street Fighter 2 that if you're specifically looking to play one version that works quite well, you might be going for a while looking for something, because each version plays drastically differently, and in some cases, the games just don't work at all. Next up, we played a couple of random entries into the Metal Slug series, and unfortunately, a lot of those games just ran really slow. Metal Slug is such a beautiful looking game, and it typically has a pretty fast frame rate, so to play it like this just seems wrong. Playing a properly emulated version of Metal Slug should look a lot better and play a lot better too. During the heyday of arcades, most arcade machines were made with very little use of any kind of language, and the reason why they did that was so that it was easy to take the arcade game and modify it to move it to other regions of the world. But there are a bunch of arcade games that were released that make heavy use of their original native language, and this one here is a quiz game for Japan, which I just can't really translate or play. And there are a number of those games on this arcade stick that are simply unable to be played unless you do know the language. But not every game requires that you know Japanese, like this one. This is Afterburner. This was a wonderful arcade game designed by Sega that made great use of sprite scaling techniques to give you this amazing visual that was not really common for any other arcade game at its time. This is Sega at its peak in arcade manufacturing, and these guys butchered it. Look at this thing. It doesn't even run nearly as close as it did in arcades. And I should know, this is one of my favorite arcade games that I used to play all the time in arcades, and to see it represented like this is just heartbreaking. But not every game is a write-off. For instance, this here is Alien vs. Predator, and it runs actually pretty good. This is kind of an important release too, because even though this is a pirated version of the game, it never saw release outside of arcades. So if you really are desperate to play it and know no other way to do it, well, this is probably a good way to do it, I guess. Arkanoid is a game that I think you really need a dial to play. A joystick just doesn't really do the trick. And when it comes to this here, well, it's emulating the game with the joystick in mind, but this original release did have a dial, so it makes the game really frustrating and really difficult to play. But this next set of games was definitely something I wasn't expecting to see. There were a number of adult-themed pornographic games that were released for certain establishments and businesses that I really won't get into in this video. Suffice to say, these games feature full-on nudity, and well, they are presented completely uncensored, and strangely enough, there was no warning about these games being included on this set. And what's really weird is that some of these games may look like a normal game at the front, like this one that looks like Dr. Mario, but then when you beat a level, you'll come face to face with this. It's not really so bad, I guess, but it gets more and more kind of revealing the longer you play the game. And believe me, it's equal opportunity because there's also nude guys on here as well. Some games, some very few games, run okay on the Pandora's Box 5S, but when it comes to anything that's running the Mega Play system, which is essentially the Sega Genesis in arcade form, well, none of them work. Not any single one. Columns 3 was basically unplayable, and so was Sonic the Hedgehog. These games were just astonishingly bad, and it's really weird to see that because this is essentially Sega Genesis hardware. You'd think they would actually have figured out how to emulate that easily, but I just guess they couldn't. And it's really evident in Streets of Rage 2, which probably has one of the greatest soundtracks ever made in a video game, and on here? It just kind of sounds awful. I just don't know what happened here because this is something that should be a lot easier to attain, but I guess it was just out of their reach. And honestly, folks, by this point, I think you're starting to get the picture. There are some games on here that seem to run decently, but they never seem to run as good as they originally did in the arcades. And for everything else, they just seem to not run at all. There are games that just won't turn on, there's a bunch of games that don't run at the proper frame rate, and other games that just have poor control inputs, or in certain cases, they don't actually have the controls emulated so you can't actually play them. It's amazing to see such a huge selection of games, but realistically, it's only a handful that are even worth playing at all. And that's one of the big problems I've had with the Pandora's Box system ever since I played the previous one. This is something that is just not very well manufactured. Yes, the hardware seems to be pretty decent enough, but it's the software that really drives something like this. Of course, you could buy this Pandora's Box system and just use it as a controller, and from my experience, it seems to work pretty decently for that, but having all those games pre-installed inside here means that they're adding extra hardware specifically for that function. If you just went out and bought a standalone arcade stick, likely you could probably get the same amount of money you're spending on this and getting a far better controller. But when you take everything into consideration for the Pandora's Box 5S, it feels really incomplete, especially with that poor emulation. Maybe sometime in the future, the Pandora's Box people will actually design these arcade sticks with real licensed software in it from real developers and publishers who actually care about representing the games properly. But until that happens, I really can't recommend buying this thing. So that is the Pandora's Box 5S. It's got a couple of improvements over the 4S Plus, but it still has a heck of a lot of issues. Even though we can guarantee you can get this exact same one in the link below, there are issues that you need to be made aware of. And on top of all of that, once we've made this video, we took a look back and noticed that the aspect ratio was wrong in the games, and in some instances it zoomed in, which was an issue you didn't find in the other Pandora's Box system we looked at. Look, at the end of the day, these systems have some cool things about them, but they still have problems that you need to be aware of that, if you're interested in buying these things at all, may put you against getting it, or they might just be things you're willing to live with. Regardless though, I think that there are more official emulation systems out there that work better than both of these. But if you do want a pretty good arcade stick, I wouldn't get this one, because this one here is just a heck of a lot better.